Yeah, thanks for having me here. This is great to be back. Walking the halls is pretty cool. Actually, one of the things I'll be talking about today is my prelim, actually. So, in terms of one of the first things that I worked on, it's been sort of with me and it's guided my thinking up until now. So the second Chris Carpenter was up here, I realized that I failed miserably, and that I forgot to bring a map. So no map, but I think we all know what the United States looks like, I think. So you can envision this. Undergrad in New Jersey, William Patterson University in Clifton. And then I got my MA and PhD here at Michigan State. And then Shane and I got jobs at Oregon State. Or she got a job at Oregon State, I got a job at Portland State, and then now we're at Penn State. So instead of a map, I was thinking maybe like a ping pong, sort of like a, kind of going back and forth like this, sort of thing. So yeah, I'm here, and I'm here to talk about some of the things that I do. My interest in groups goes back to basically when I started here as a grad student. And I think of myself as taking, or let me get the timer here so I don't go over. I think of myself as doing three kinds of research. I kind of do stuff on groups and teams. I do stuff on leadership, dynamics, and I also do stuff on more methods-based. It's, things like, and mainly measurement stuff. So Frank and I have worked on some pretty cool things lately. So my talk today, I decided to focus on this because I've got a handful of studies that I could sort of present to you about this. I don't have the 50 that Chris presented. I only have 3. So, so I'm going to tell you a lot about a little. I guess you can think of it that way. Okay, so there we go. All right, so teams, groups, which I kind of think of as interchangeable. I mean, they're not in the sense that all teams are groups, but not all groups are teams. But the interest in groups and teams stems from recently in the organizational sector, what we tend to see is that organizations are trying to move away from this sort of bureaucratic, top-down kind of structure, and they're trying to flatten it. And they're trying to do it such that we have teams that are composed of different people with different expertises, that you could say harness the different ideas that they have in order to come up with solutions that are more innovative, make better decisions, better outcomes, that sort of thing. So this is an organizational problem that people usually think of, and they're really concerned about it because if you're going to structure your entire organization around a team-based model, you better make sure the teams are working, kind of thing. And as we all know, working in groups and teams is it's not always great. So it doesn't always work out the way that you want it to. So the one thing that I'll be focusing on today is cohesion. The reason for that being that cohesion has been studied a long time. And ironically, even though we have studied it a long time, we're still not quite sure exactly what it is, or how it's nested with sort of this broader, group dynamics framework. So that's kind of where I started, and that's kind of where I've been moving and where I'm at right now. So I'll talk about these kinds of things. So the presentation, what I'll do is I'll just start by defining cohesion. I'll define a few other things too as I work through these other 3 studies here. So I got a few pieces, one in 2016, which was the prelim. I got a 2020 piece and a 2022 piece, which I'll discuss. And basically what I'm trying to understand is, and you'll see a common thread in terms of conflict-like variables and how that's related to cohesion, because I think those 2 things are highly associated. This idea that people in groups, they disagree, and that's going to make them less collaborative in nature, not like each other and that sort of thing. So that's where I'll be. Keep pressing the wrong button. Here we go. Okay, so Manata 2016. Chris was talking about PTSD while he was doing his studies, and while I was putting this presentation together, I was having similar traumatic thoughts. And I think Shannon said that I developed circadian sleep disorder during that time. She might be right about that. I might be still experiencing those effects. I don't know. But yeah, I got a pub, so that's good. Totally worth it. All right, so cohesion, what is it? So it's a group level property. All right, Alex pointed out that I do a lot of multi-level stuff. So I deal with I deal with constructs that aren't exactly individual level differences. Although usually you have to start there in order to get to that level. So a group level property that aids in keeping members together. So leanness, together, connectivity, that sort of thing. Tight-knit, you can think of it that way. So typically in this literature, people think of this as an emergent level property. And people have different ways of trying to conceptualize how things emerge. So one of those ways is called a consensus model. And what this means is that the meaning of the construct is the same at different levels of analysis. Which is all to say that, so for example, if you have 5 people on a team, and they all agree and they all say this is a cohesive group, then it makes sense to treat that mean as a property of the group. They're cohesive and they're not. So in that sense, that's what I mean by when I say things like these are isomorphic and cohesion can emerge in that sort of way. Basically little clusters of cohesion that's kind of popping up in groups. People also distinguish between different kinds of cohesion. So the two that I focused on here, and this kind of goes back all the way to Fessinger's distinction here, where he talked about task cohesion as being, for example, task unification and collaboration. So do we work well together? Are we all motivated to engage in the task and do the thing? And social cohesion, do we like each other? Do we like the group? Do we want to be in the group? Fessinger also talked about this concept called group pride, but it's not as researched, and maybe you're probably asking, why don't you do it here? Well, I'll get to it. But I focus on these two. These are the two ones that you see in meta-analyses pop up consistently over and over again. And when people do this kind of research and they try to see what's the average effect of cohesion or the different cohesions here, what we see is that typically we tend to see a very simple yes. If your groups are cohesive, you're gonna increase performance here. All right. So you may predict 2 very simple positive effects here. Nothing fancy. The other thing, yeah, right. Hypothesized models to predict a regression case. So the other thing is that cohesion is usually treated as a mediator of things. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about all the things that I learned in GroupCom and all the different stuff that I've read and things like this. And the one thing that stood out to me was conflict. And when I started to get into this, I started to see that people had different kinds of conflict. And one of the ones that I thought was quite interesting is this notion of relationship conflict. This notion that people have different values, belief systems, different personalities. Basically, they're dissimilar. And this, as you might imagine, might yield greater tension, interpersonal tension between people and that sort of thing. So relationship conflict here. So in terms of what we might expect, as you can imagine, I mean, if people, if there's a lot of interpersonal tension, social cohesion is going to decrease. If people don't like each other, or if people are very different, they're going to avoid each other, and it's going to be hard to, say, collaborate on a task, for example. So you might expect both types of cohesion to decrease here. So this is what I predicted, sort of a very simple, I guess what Frank would call a diamond model. It's very simple. You got 2 parallel mediators, they're both behaving in the same way. Where relationship conflict is attenuating both cohesions, which then has implications for performance. What's also interesting about this, and people don't usually think about this, but if you've ever taken a GroupCom class or taught a GroupCom class, you've probably heard about Bruce Tuckman's old forming, storming, norming, and performing, right? All his ings are in there, right? And it actually, well, if you look at this model, if you take out the forming part, you basically have the storming, you have the norming, and then you have the performing. So you actually, it's kind of here a little bit. I mean, he predicts that all groups will eventually norm and then eventually they'll perform. My prediction is a bit different. My prediction is that if you can't get out of the fighting stage, you're not going to be very cohesive and you're not going to perform well. But it's still, I mean, the theoretical logic is kind of the same. So he was kind of seeing the same things too, and what he was doing. So I wanted to test this. Okay. So how did I test it? This is where the trauma comes in. All right, so did it here, down the hall, 3-person groups, very hard to get 3 undergrads to show up at one place at the same time. 78 times. It's very difficult. It was a lab study. We did it in the lab down the hall, right there, where the GR Miller lab, where we had, the 3 different rooms in the control lab and that sort of thing. And you can think of this as having sort of 3 main components. The first component here was I tried to induce relationship conflict. Now this is hard to do because, as you can imagine, to get 3 students together and then have them fight about something is very difficult when all they want to do is just be in there and get hurt and leave. So I did something that I had seen done before in literature, and it was effective at inducing this kind of thing, and it was just giving false feedback. So what I did was I created a personality test, a fake one, and I had these people, I split them up, and I had them take this thing, and then when I collected their data, I pretended to analyze it in the hallway. And then I came back, theatrics. And then I came back. Oh, do you remember Travis Trice?
Yeah.
He was in this study. Okay, I just breached IRB and all that.
There goes confidentiality.
Yeah, well, you don't know which one he was in, so neither do I. All right, let me revert here. So, so I pretended to analyze these scores, and I was pretending to write things down, these numbers. And then I would either tell them that they were either very similar. I would say something like, "These are the highest scores I've ever seen. You guys are super similar." Or I would tell them, "These are the worst scores I've ever seen. I've never seen anything that's bad before." Yeah, and I mean, in that condition, you might actually, some students would turn white because when I brought them together, they were a little freaked out. They were like, "What am I getting myself into here?" Especially when Travis Trice walks into the room. So what's that? Yeah, right. So that's what I did. Now, of course, conflict, as you'll see, the mean was pretty low, but I still found a noticeable difference between 2 conditions. It still kind of worked, but we can talk more about that after if you want. But that's what I did to try to induce that. Something else I did was I had them perform what's called a hidden profile task. So this was, at the time, I was doing a lot of stuff with Frank. We did some stuff on the hidden profiles and political partisanship. Gwen Wittenbaum was instrumental here because she was doing a lot of stuff on hidden profiles, and she, was helping me think about these sorts of things, or she introduced me to this paradigm. What the hidden profile task is basically, it's an information sharing task where we give people in the group different sets of information about different profiles. So the idea is that we can get, say, 3 people in a group, and then we give them, here's some information about some people, say a faculty member, right? Who should we hire? And then they have to make a decision about who the correct choice is. The thing about the hidden profile is that the profiles are constructed in a way where everyone goes in, or at least initially, everyone went in expecting, or at least biased towards the wrong decision. So they like the suboptimal candidate going into the group. And the hidden candidate, the correct answer, if you wanted to get this right, was hidden within the information, within the group. And they had to kind of pool their information together in a way to sort of solve the puzzle. You could think of it that way. So we did that by taking some of the information and making it shared versus unshared. So some people had the same information, and there were pockets of information that were just unique to the different people in the group. Now, initially, in this area, what Stacer and Titus did was they had 2 candidates, and they biased everyone towards the wrong candidate, and then, surprise, all 3 students came into the room. They said, "Who did you prefer?" And they all said the wrong candidate, and they left. Right? And the conclusion was, groups don't share information, groups suck, right? All these sorts of things. And we still find that effect, but I wanted to sort of push back a little bit on that, or at least to move beyond that. So what I did was I designed profiles for 3 different candidates, and I try to bias people in different directions. So I did it such that member 1 would be biased towards candidate A, member 2 towards candidate B, and member 3 towards candidate C, and he or she was the right answer. And so I did, there was 2 pilot studies to do this, to sort of find the different sets of information. And then a second one just to ensure that these things were actually biasing people in the intended direction, and typically we found that. So But either way, I mean, even if it didn't work, I would still get like a 2-to-1 sort of conflict. So the students would sit down, and they wouldn't just be able to say A, all right? They would actually have to talk through it, sort of thing. So I was trying to create sort of conflict in that sense. Okay. So following the decision after they were done, some were quicker than others. I also measured, I had self-reports of these things. So I had relationship conflict, and you can see these items are aligned with the sort of things that I've been talking about. So for example, in this group, personality conflict was evident, right? Much like the induction. The other thing, so you see the general sort of statistics here that you typically see. The other thing that I want to point out here is the ICC-1, which is the interclass correlation coefficient. If you're not familiar with this, and you probably are, but if you're not, this simple equation, all that is basically just between group variance divided by total variance. So you can think of it as a proportion, almost like a squared correlation, a reliability coefficient in that sense. So that 0.35 is indicating that 35% of the variance is attributable to a group factor. You could think of it that way. Another way that people think about it is that it's an estimate of clustering or dependence, right? So in that sense, the reason I'm showing you this is because this provides evidence for that sort of consensus model that I was telling you about, where you have this thing where it's like, well, people are clustering around different means, all right? So it makes sense to take the average of those individual level responses in order to treat the group mean as the property of the group. So I have that in there as well. I also measured the different cohesions, task and social cohesion. So again, the items are what you would expect here. Our group is unified when completing the task, as opposed to I would not want to be friends with these people, sort of thing, right? And you'd be surprised at how easily it was for people to be like, I don't like these people at all. Decision accuracy was a simple, did you choose candidate C or not? And if you're wondering how did you know that was the right answer, blah, 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 all these things, well, that's a good point. But at the same time, during the pilot studies, we also gave a sub-portion of the subjects all the information about all candidates, and overwhelmingly they chose C as the right answer. So in the population, C is probably the right answer here, in part because there was a lot more positives than negatives in favor of that candidate. Okay, so what did I find? Oh yeah, validity, right. That thing. Okay, all right, so we see a few things here. I can speak about this in a few different ways. So I could start by saying here are the how strong are the paths? So and what direction are they in? So for relationship conflict, right, we see two negative associations in the expected direction. They both attenuate both cohesions, or conflict attenuates both cohesions. Although one seems to be stronger than the other. And I also noticed that task cohesion has a strong positive impact, or at least a modest positive impact on decision accuracy, choosing C. Social cohesion, not so much. Path was non-ample, you might say. The other thing, too, is that this model failed miserably. The RMSC was 0.39, which is big. That's bad. That's a lot of error. And the reason that was happening is because the correlation between both cohesions was incredibly strong. So that was not good in terms of trying to get this thing to fit. So I started by let me just remove social cohesion to see if that does anything. Yeah, there you go. Hey, all right. So now we got the RMSE down to 0.04. This model fit pretty well, and it suggests a very simple mediation, a simple causal string here, such that the effective relationship conflict on decision accuracy is mediated by task cohesion. If I replace the relationship conflict measure with the induction variable, it still fits. So this seemed to be at least a promising direction. So the other thing that I wanted to do here was I didn't want to completely jettison social cohesion, so I started to rethink it in a post hoc manner for sure. And at this time I was taking a class from Steve Kozlowski, and I don't think he's here anymore. I think he's in Florida now. Is there? Yeah. And he was giving me a lot of papers on team effectiveness by people by him. Yeah. Right. Dan Ilgen, Richard Hackman, these big names in management. And they would think of team effectiveness as, yes, we have things like quality, we have have things like performance, we have things like timeliness. But there was also this component of social well-being, wanting to remain in the group, liking each other. I mean, this kind of sounds like social cohesion, but they were just calling it viability. So is the team viable or not? So I thought, and Gwen, she would also classify or conceptualize social cohesion as an outcome. So I thought, well, maybe they're right. So let me see if this model is correct here. So I tested this model, and you see the coefficients are as expected, or at least to me, it's not surprising here. But also this model fit pretty well. So here we have a case where the effect of relationship conflict on two different kinds of outcomes, one of which is performance-based and one of which is social-based, is mediated by task cohesion in this sense, which is kind of like saying that, well, relationship conflict has implications for different kinds of group-level outcomes. Now, okay, so I was going to say a few things, but I'll just wait because this is going to get a little bit more complicated as we go. All right, so a few limitations. One of them is the post hoc treatment of social cohesion. It could have been due to sampling error. I could have gotten lucky there. Who knows? So I wanted to replicate that. The other thing is, and I don't think this is a huge problem, but the artificial context, and this is the thing that all reviewers make me put in my discussion, that sort of thing, right? But I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to address this kind of stuff, then we can just take this out to the field. So that's what I did here in 2020. Okay, so here, this was a field study where I was dealing with teams that were nested with real teams that were nested within an organizational context. I was also interested in the dual level of cohesion, so task and social cohesion here as well. But instead of relationship conflict, I thought, well, let me pick a variable here that is, I guess you might say, conflict adjacent. So it's not exactly relationship conflict, but it's conflict-like in the sense that, well, as you'll see, what I'm going to be telling you about is this concept of LMX differentiation, which is this idea that people get treated differently within a group. And in that sense, if people are getting treated in a dissimilar manner, right, that's kind of conflict adjacent, you might say. All right, so let me just define what LMX is here. Leadership. Old dyadic theory introduced by this guy named George Grain. And at the time, this was kind of a radical idea. It doesn't seem radical now, but at the time it was. And it was this, so at the time in the 70s, people would think that, well, leaders, everyone treats everyone else the same. And George Grain came along and said, not true. I mean, some people like other people more than others, sort of thing. So in this sense, the supervisor-subordinate relationship might actually be varied, such that I'm going to give you more support, and I'm not going to give you any support at all because I don't like you. So in that sense, what people started to find was that there were in-groups and out-groups sort of forming based on this property of these sort of LMX, leader-member exchange relationships, which were classified, you can characterize it by high relational quality, so things like strong affect, loyalty, respect, these kinds of things, and supportive social exchanges. And support can come in lots of different ways. Instrumental, for example, resources, advice, these kinds of things. If you were in the in-group, then you were you were classified as this high-quality LMX person, right? So mutual liking, this was both ways. Mutual liking, mutual respect, support, etc., that sort of thing. If you were in the out-group, it was more economic sort of thing. It was more transactional, if you think of it that way. All right, so LMX, what I was just telling you about, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, it's obvious now because we have a lot of research on this. But if you're in as your LMX goes up, we see people do better. They're more likely to get promoted, they're more likely to get raises, they're more likely to be supported in these sorts of things. So these people that get along well with their supervisors tend to do better. LMX differentiation tries to take that concept and kind of turn it on its head a bit, because, so going back to the concept of a group, it is the case that, yes, I have a relationship with my manager or supervisor, but it's also the case that there are usually more subordinates in the equation here. You can think of this as a faculty having numerous grad students, right? And treating some differently than others, sort of thing. And in that sense, the LMX relationships are differentiated within the group. So my question was, what does that do to the cohesion of the group, right? Where it's obvious that some people are getting treated differently than others. Now, the research on this, I think, is pretty clear in terms of it's usually not, the effects are not positive. We see things like, it's associated with things like relationship conflict. It's associated with things like perceptions of injustice. People don't like to work in these kinds of climates because they feel like it's not fair. So in that sense, if that is the case, then we would expect cohesion to be attenuated both on the task front and the social front, because I don't like you and I don't want to work with you, sort of thing, right? It's an awkward environment to be in. So this too, you can classify as an emergent level property, but it's slightly different in that it's not isomorphic, right? So you couldn't just take the average of LMX and just get an LMX differentiation variable. This is a bit different. So with this one, people try to take, it's more compilational. It's more some people call them dispersion models. So they use dispersion statistics to sort of model this. So for example, variance, or in my case, I use the standard deviation. So the standard deviation is the value, it's the construct, right? So as the SD increases here, as relationships get more varied, we would see decreases in both cohesions. So the prediction was that would happen, and that would have implications for performance. Okay, so hypothesized model. This should look familiar. In part because, well, I thought, well, that's different now because now you see model A, right? Because there's going to be a model B. Model A was based on my initial thinking, which was that, well, if cohesion is a mediator, and we have two different elements here of two different types of cohesion, they should be parallel mediators. So the prediction was the same here. But because of my 2016 piece, because of the trauma-induced prelim, I had this one as well. So I predicted this one, so I wanted to see, well, is this going to replicate or not, right? So what's right here? So I went out, I tested this in the field. I thought that was for me. Oh, it is for me. What's this for?
You're sniffling.
Oh, thank you. Tap, tap, okay.
You save a lot of health con people.
Brian, you're
here.
so caring.
What's that?
Supportive.
Oh, thank you. Ron and I have a very strong LMX exchange relationship. I was his first, well, he was my first TA job was for Ron. And, yeah.
How'd that go?
Oh, you want a side story? So for the final, I was really hungry. And I decided that I wanted to get pizza. And I showed up late to the final with the exams. And Ron was shaking with anger. I also forgot my phone at home, so he was calling me and unable to reach me because I was getting pizza without a phone. And then when I walked in, all the students, 275 students and 275 media, started clapping. And then Ron said, next time hold the pizza. All right, back to the talk.
Live to tell the story.
So, thank you, Ron. Yeah. Okay. So, okay, sample. Right, back to this exciting stuff. All right. So, what did I do here? So here, I was dealing with resident assistants who actually worked in teams. They called them substaffs, and there were 45 of them. And I learned that all 45 of them had formal managers, or what they called ACDs, or assistant community directors here. So I thought, well, this is cool because we have these sort of tailor-made teams, and there's a manager in here, and he's got different relationships with these people in the teams. So I thought this is one way to sort of try to test this. So I gave the same measures for the social and task cohesion. You'll see that the item content is essentially the same. The only thing I changed was that I made it about substaffs, for example, right? Not teams or groups or anything like that. Although I could have, but that was their language. Yeah. The other thing too is for the LMX, I changed it to, instead of manager or supervisor, it was about the ACD. And you'll notice here that I have descriptives not for LMX, but for LMX differentiation. So you have things like mean SD, and yeah, the SD of the SD. I know, it's one of those nerdy things where I thought it was funny, and I thought maybe other academics will think that's funny too. We're such nerds. Okay, so for team performance, there were 2 measures here. I only used one, but the results were the same, so it really didn't matter effectively. One of them was a one-item measure of how good is your team. It turns out that the mean is about a B. So if you ask anyone, how good are you? They'll say about a B, is what I tend to find here. I also had the formal evaluations from the managers, which you could, I did. You could take this and you can create that sort of consensus. You could take that consensus approach and create a team level average of the different evaluations. The problem is that the data were incredibly incomplete. But at the same time, so I went with the one that would give me a bigger sample size. But at the same time, it doesn't matter which one I use, the results were the same there. And oh yeah, validity again, that important thing. All right.
Huh.
Yeah, right. So, okay, so here's the model, all right, and maybe you'll see something similar here. All right, we have a case where LMX, as the standard deviation is increasing, we're seeing both cohesions decrease. And then we're seeing task cohesion has a strong effect on performance, social cohesion not so much, right? So we're seeing the same thing. In fact, when you test the model, you get kind of the same thing. The RMSE is 0.4, it's pretty big, it's almost identical to the previous one. So I thought, okay, well, I guess that's encouraging in the sense that I saw the same failure twice. So I'm probably going to move on from that. The second model fit much better, actually, and the coefficients were big and they were in the anticipated direction, right? So as groups become increasingly differentiated in terms of how supportive some people are being treated compared to others, we would expect task collaboration to go down, which then has implications for different kinds of outcomes. So that's what I was seeing here. Okay, so limitations of this. When do I have until?
Oh, I think 2:30. Anybody have the count?
Probably 2:30.
I think
2:45? Okay, so I have okay, all right, okay. All right,
keep.
all right, yeah, keep going. All right. More stories for about Ron later, okay.
I would pass my part.
All right, so limitations, small sample size. I'm probably not going to get rid of that problem anytime soon because I'm studying groups. Studying groups is tough in terms of getting large sample sizes and these sorts of things. But another problem that, again, reviewers usually bring up is, well, it's cross-sectional, so you can't tell which direction it's going in. Not necessarily the case in the first study because I had an induction and I had an objective measure there, so I kind of knew the order of the variables. But I couldn't say, for example, that cohesion wasn't causing conflict in other contexts. So I couldn't. I had evidence for one direction, not the other. So I wanted to look at that. So that's where Manata and Bozeman comes in. Jessica Bozeman is one of my collaborators at Penn State. She's a grad student there, postdoc now. So here, what I was interested in was conflict and cohesion over time. So what's causing what here? So here I went for a slightly different approach. And so here's what I mean by that. So I complicated it just a little bit. So here you see the items that I used, and I have in a square, you'll see the 3 constructs that I've already described to you. We have things like relationship conflict, and we have the 2 cohesions. At the top there, the top left, you see an additional type of conflict called task conflict, which is this, we disagree on how to write a paper. We disagree on how to do a study, which is different than having interpersonality or interpersonal differences, dissimilarity in that sense. Now, the problem with this is that people tend to try to split those 2 kinds of conflict up, but the problem is that in practice, they're correlated really, really strongly. Usually when you have one, you have the other. And by strongly, I mean you're looking at about correlations of like 0.75, uncorrected, right? So you're dealing with a massive problem here in terms of multilinearity, or as I was kind of thinking at the time, I was thinking, well, maybe these things are just measuring something broader. There's a second order factor here. So on the right, you'll see an additional column. So you have the item loadings, but I'm also showing you are trait loadings here, and you'll see that, well, I thought, well, if this is happening with relational conflict, the strong correlation between the two cohesions was also causing me problems. So I'm thinking, well, maybe there's just a simpler, a two-factor sort of solution here, where you have two unidimensional, second-order unidimensional factors here. And I'll show you, I have the results of that, but there was evidence for that, where you have the two different kinds of conflict all measuring the same thing, and you have the two different kinds of cohesion measuring the same thing. So conflict, cohesion. So the model itself is much simpler here. So here we have a longitudinal sort of path model, and we have conflict and cohesion over time. If you're wondering where performance was, or is, it's not here, and that's because my TA, now I have TA problems, gave everyone an A. So there was no variance in performance, which means it didn't correlate with anything. So I had to get rid of it. So I will, it might be back next year. Maybe I'll have some more data for you. So here I'm just focusing on conflict and cohesion. Yeah, so let me see what else.
Well, what goes around comes around.
Just can't escape it. Karma. Kismet. Okay, so here I made some strong predictions here in terms of I expected conflict to attenuate cohesion given my previous work on this. I wasn't quite sure what would happen with the cohesion effect on conflict, so I kept it open. I know I have a negative effect there, but it was an RQ. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen there. So this was the model that I set out to test. So how did I test this? Well, this I did while I was at Portland State, and we were on the quarter system, so there were terms. And I was teaching 3 different group communication classes. So I thought, well, I'm going to have these groups. They're going to be forming. They're going to be working throughout the term, and they're going to be doing some sort of project. Let's measure it here. Let's see what this does to their their dynamics throughout the term. So quarter system, 11 weeks. Yeah, so I sampled them. So there were 33 groups here, and about 110 students that I could sample from, and I got, I want to say, estimates for all 3 time points for 25 of them. So not a huge sample, but again, group level stuff is hard. And actually, of the people that I could have gotten, given that this was voluntary, I was actually kind of surprised that I got as many people to respond as I did. Just for the kindness of their heart. So I surveyed them at 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and 11 weeks, right at the end. So I let them develop, and then I caught them at 3 different time points here. Okay, so a few results here before I show you the modeling. So class has no effect on anything, so I ignored it. So it didn't matter which class you were in. I didn't have an impact on conflict or cohesion. It doesn't matter what I did with it. It didn't have an effect on anything. So that was good. I can ignore it. I also tested to see if the demographics mattered here, and this was one of those things that a reviewer asked for. One of those things that reviewers ask for, not really knowing what they're asking for. They were like, well, what about the demographics? And I realized, oh boy, okay, well, I have 4 different levels of analysis here. I'm dealing with, well, you have time nested within person, and person nested within group, and then group nested within class. So I'm thinking, yeah, right, oh. So if you like the study, enjoy it, because I'm never doing it again. So anyway, so I went down the HLM rabbit hole, and I constructed a 4-level HLM model, all to pretty much figure out that demographics didn't matter. So that was encouraging, because then I could ignore that as well. The other thing I did was I tested the heck out of the second order unidimensional model. So I tested it sort of using a naive analysis where I didn't care about dependence, I didn't care about the different levels of analysis, but I also did some additional work to show, and you can see that it fits, and I also did some additional work to show that the factor structure remained invariant between time points and between classes. And when I say invariant, I mean the factor structure was the same, factor loadings were generally the same, intercepts were the same, as well as the residuals. I also performed a multi-level CFA, and this fit as well. And this all basically is just to show that, well, this model fits when you're dealing with people, and it fits when you're dealing with item averages too. So I analyzed the heck out of this thing, and it worked. Didn't matter what I threw at it. It just kind of just kind of fit, it worked, and that was great, because that simplified my analysis considerably. Because you'll notice here the class variable is ignored, the time variable is taken care of because I have this wide format, right? And then I'm not dealing with person level variables, so everything's at the group level. It's beautiful in that way. So a few things to notice here. All right, yeah. So I guess I could start with the autocorrelations. 3 out of the 4 are in the anticipated direction. Conflict to conflict to conflict, that makes sense. Cohesion at time 2 to cohesion at time 3, that makes sense. Positive association. They're not super big, but they're where I would expect it. The one thing I cannot explain is cohesion at time 1 having a small negative effect on cohesion at time 2. I chalk that up to sampling error. Small sample, I'm not sure what's going on there. But that was something that happened. The other thing that I'll point out is that you can see here that the effect of conflict on cohesion at both time points is much stronger than the opposite, where you have cohesion having much smaller effects on conflict at times 2 and 3, right? So actually, when you reduce those non-ample parameters, the model fits pretty well. So if I were to sort of say plant a flag in terms of what's causing what, I would probably, if I were to do this again, I would probably predict that, well, if you have conflict, you're definitely going to have cohesion. If you have cohesion, not so sure that that's going to have many implications for conflict. So again, if I were to plant that flag, that's where I'm at right now, basically. So that's where I'm at right now. I would also say that I'm consistently seeing that cohesion acts as an important mediator of conflict-like variables. I'm sort of seeing that, which kind of provides some evidence for what Tuckman was saying and some of my own thinking here as a grad student, and even now. Performance seems to be a key outcome. Where do we stand? Well, if you noticed, the results of the third study kind of complicate the first 2 studies, in that because I guess, maybe not technically, I'm not sure. If you have two variables in the same path model that are technically indicators of the same thing, the path model should technically fail. It shouldn't fit in that way. And here I'm having 2 sets of analyses, neither of which I can fault. Which one is saying is that these are 2 second-order factors, and here it's saying I'll keep them separate, right? Because it's more nuanced in this way. So I have thoughts about that in terms of how that could happen. But I think it's an interesting problem because it speaks to the general problem of what is the dimensionality of this cohesion construct. And as I said, people are still arguing about this. Donald Forsythe is still raving about this. He cited the 2016 piece and was like, hey, he's looking at collaboration, it's not cohesion, right? So this is sort of something that people are still trying to figure out right now. The other thing that I'm interested in working on right now is to what extent does that model B kind of replicate across, right? How much of that is happening in different papers? So what I'm doing for that is I'm working on a set of meta-analyses that I keep bothering Frank about. 2 different sets of meta-analyses. And I say sets because there's going to be a lot of stuff here. So the first set is going to focus on, I'm going to see if I can pin down this dimensionality problem of conflict and cohesion. So I have 3 different grad students scouring the literature. We've compiled over 600 articles. We've coded, we're almost done. I think we have about 250, 300 articles coded. And the idea here is that if I could create this matrix here, where we have 6 different meta-analyzed correlations, right? I can test the two item and the 2 item case for the 2 conflicts and the 2 cohesions to see, and using the parallelism stuff to see if that will fit. So I can apply to so basically across studies, is this construct, would it be simpler to just sort of aggregate it or not, or keep it separate? So depending on the result of that, that's going to inform the way that I approach the second analysis or the second study. So if it's not second order, unidimensional, if I don't find that, then I'll test model B. But if it is, then I think that would be a breakthrough in that we would just have a very simple causal string XYZ, and that would simplify the 2 models that I showed you the first time, and it would provide more credibility to the analysis of the third study that I did. So that's where I'm at right now. That's where I'm going. Again, if you had waited another year or two, I would have been able to present that. But we're still coding and we're still looking and that sort of thing. But I mean, I'm sure something cool will happen with that, and you'll be able to find it. But the reason that that I think this is really cool is that at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that people are really interested in this problem of interdisciplinary sort of teams and that kind of thing. And I was talking to a biologist. This is like all the rage right now in the life sciences. It's trying to get people that have very different expertises in the life sciences together to sort of to make them come up with really innovative ideas. The problem is of course they all speak different. They have different jargon, and they all have different methods, and they all want to do different things, and they all think different things. So a lot of, you might say, conflict is happening there. So their concern is, how do we keep these teams cohesive? How do we keep them working in a way that would make them keep them innovative, right? To give us big things. So I was telling this biologist, his name was Steve Schaefer at Penn State, that we can actually look at these things. You know, this is something that we do on this side of the house. And he said, what do you mean, like with a general theory of group dynamics? And I said, no, we don't have that. We're not quite there yet. But I was like, maybe we should. Maybe we should. And I was thinking of this, and I was like, well, I keep finding that damn Model B. Like, it keeps popping up, right? And maybe there's something simpler here, but just a simple XYZ. So if I can show in this meta-analysis, which I'm hoping to see that something will come to this, if it is the case that that model, that old school Tuckman logic is just replicating across paper, conflict, cohesion, performance, right? If we can create some sort of base, very simple theoretical framework that we can sort of, kind of like the TRA. I mean, you're talking about 4 different boxes there, right? If we can create that, and then we can sort of build on it in like a Cronbach-Emile type of way, nomothetic validity and that sort of thing, nomothetic nets. If we can build on that, right, then we can start working towards this sort of general theory of group dynamics, right? If you do this in the group, you can expect that sort of thing to happen. So that's where I'm headed. That's what I'm doing on the team stuff, the group stuff. Yeah. Thanks.
Brian, there's